Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the And God Said podcast. I'm your host, Reverend Kimberly Constant, and this podcast is offered in connection with a Bible study I teach called Cover to Cover, in which we read through every book of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. If you're interested in that, you can find more info on my website, kimberlyconstantministries.com. So this lecture is going to be preparing you for reading and studying 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And I've entitled it Revisionist History, ? Setting the scene for 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So when we look at where we are in history, we are covering the time period that we just looked at. If you were with me for the books of not Solomon, Samuel and Kings, this is that same time period. So we're going to pick up the story at the end of Saul's reign and the beginning of David's reign as king, and it's going to continue all the way through the southern kingdom being taken into exile by Babylon in 586, and it's going to end with the decree of Cyrus. And in terms of the chronological order of the Bible, we have been pretty chronological up until now. Everything's been in somewhat of an order. Every once in a while things get moved around, but for the most part, we've been on a continual evolutionary timeline. Now that stops, and we're just going to keep revisiting the same time period here through the lens of the chronicler. When we get to the wisdom literature, it's going to be even through a different lens, and then the books of the prophets. But it's all this very same time period, the history of Israel as a nation. So it's authorship, it's one continuous book, just like we saw with Samuel, just like we saw with Kings, believed to have been authored by Ezra, who also is believed to have authored Ezra and Nehemiah, which we will look at after Chronicles. The probable date for the completion of this book is sometime around 500 BC. As with all books of the Bible, certainly it was contributed to by scribes and editors as well. Much of this material is now truly history. So when we read 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, those books, at least the majority of the material, was written pretty close to when the events actually happened. Here we've got some time. Like if you think of the beginning of David's reign, there's something like almost 500 years that have elapsed from the start of David's reign to the completion of these books, or this one book that turned into two books. So it is truly history, and it gives the chronicler a chance to kind of step back and take a look at what has transpired and figure out what thread of the story he wants to follow. He's going to pull out what he thinks is of lasting significance. And there's a unique perspective that he brings because he lives in the period of the Second Temple, in the time after exile, in the time in which Israel is no longer a sovereign nation. God's people are united solely by religion, and they're really known as the Jewish people at this point. So it's quite a different perspective, a perspective of not being in charge, of being subject to whoever is governing them at the time, and kind of looking to the future, to a future hope. So the genres you'll find as you're reading, mostly it's a historiography, but there is some biography as well, and definitely genealogies. The first good chunk of Chronicles is just genealogies. So the structure begins with those genealogies, and important to note there is that they start from Adam and trace all the way to the people who are post-exile. So the chronicler is establishing a continuity there, that these people who are now living on the other side of the broken and fallen kingdom of Israel are still the same people. They are connected to what God has done before. And then he picks up the story with the reign of David and Solomon, and that's the major focus of the book. So 1st Chronicles chapter 10 all the way through 2nd Chronicles chapter 9 looks at the reigns of these two kings. This is kind of the golden age of Israel when things are pretty good for the most part. The heart of this material is the Davidic covenant, which we already learned about in Kings, and here it is emphasized as well. This promise, remember the Davidic covenant is the promise of a Messiah to come, that David's line would always have a place on the throne, and that one day, like the ultimate king will come from David's line. they are clinging to this promise, because things, which we'll discover when we look at the next two books, Ezra and Nehemiah, things in exile aren't as great as one might hope. The return to Jerusalem is not quite as triumphant as one might expect. And like I said, they're no longer a sovereign nation. They're in a much humbler position. And so they are really looking to that future promise of a Messiah who would come and rescue Israel and return it to its former glory. Then the second Chronicles chapter 10 through chapter 28 looks at Judah during the time of the divided kingdom. Now the focus is always on Judah, on that southern kingdom. There's not much mention at all of the northern kingdom of Israel. And then Second Chronicles chapters 29 through 36 look at Judah when it is the only kingdom after Israel is taken into exile. The themes that you will find: God's sovereignty, that's of course traced all the way through Scripture, but here honed in on because of where they are at in the post-exilic world. They really need to establish God's sovereignty, that God is part of this plan, that even when there's mistakes made and sins and grievous things happen, God is still there. He's still sovereign, and he is still working to redeem the world. So there's a sense of continuity here. He starts with the genealogies because he's trying to connect the people to that plan of God's, that just because things broke and Israel as a kingdom ceased to exist does not mean that God's plan has ceased or that God has left or abandoned them as a people group. There's a big theme of faithfulness. In the time of post-exilic Judaism, the temple became extremely important. That is what centered them. They no longer had central government. They didn't even have a government of their own. They were subject to whoever was ruling over their region at the time. And so religion becomes key. God's law, the temple, observing God's law, and keeping that sense of community. They believed that in the temple there was the promise of forgiveness for a repentant people. And here, this faithfulness counterbalances kind of those conditional blessings and curses of the historic books. So the historic books really dealt with if we are obedient, we will be fruitful, because that's the terms of the Mosaic covenant. And if we are disobedient, that fruitfulness will be removed. Well, now that covenant has been broken, it's a look at God's continued mercy and forgiveness for the people. There's also a theme of individual responsibility. We're going to see that more in the post-exilic world. There's a fresh start for each person. Individual actions have consequences. It's not just about what happens as the nation. They are no longer a nation. And so the importance of the individual comes into play here. And of course, God's grace. And we see that in these verses I'm going to read to you from 2 Chronicles 7, chapter 14 through 16. And God says this: "If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and heal their land. Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayers offered in this place. I have chosen and consecrated this temple so that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there." So you can see again the importance of the temple, why they're honing in on that, and just the promise that with repentance, God extends grace. So some things to note as you study this material. As I've said before, it is going to be very familiar. Some of it is repeated just word for word almost from what we read in Samuel and Kings, but there's a twist to it. It's highly interpretive. It's concerned with Israel's history and pulling meaning out of it. It's not just like, I'm going to give you history, just a mere recitation of facts. His concern is deriving meaning from that history. And so he's going to be selective in what he presents to us. Of course, this is true of all historical works. It is nearly impossible to record everything that happens, there are always editorial decisions made in presenting a work of history. No matter which history, even Kings, that could be said. I'm sure there's stories that got left out of the books of Kings and Samuel. But here we get to see that process in play because we get to know what is left out because we have the other version to compare it to. So it's interesting in that respect. The chronicler tells us and the Israelites post exile how and how not to live by presenting the people with positive and negative role models. The numbers in Chronicles are inflated. This should not be a surprise to us by now because we know that numbers in the Old Testament especially do not correlate with numbers as we understand and interpret them today. Here it does appear to be deliberate. It's a rhetorical strategy to enhance the glory of Israel and to remember those golden years as wonderful years in which all was right in the nation of Israel. All right, so that brings us to an end. For those of you who are in the study and who will be reading through this material, or those of you who just follow the podcast and like to read through the material, I always suggest with Chronicles, if you need to skim, feel free to skim. You don't have to read every single word. Those genealogies get lengthy and the names are hard to pronounce. Maybe here's where you might try listening to the Bible. There's some wonderful apps to help you listen rather than just read, or you can even read as you're listening, which is another way to reinforce the material. But like I said, feel free to skim and just try to hone in on what is new or different, what feels different to you. Just to give you a heads up, there's some more information about Manasseh. There's more information right at the beginning, starting around chapter 10 of First Chronicles, and going into the story of David and Solomon and the building of the temple. There's some new information in there as well. And then as you skim, kind of notice what gets left out, because there's a lot that gets left out. And we'll talk about that in the next lecture. All right, everyone. Happy reading and happy studying. And I'll see you for the next lecture where we look at what we're going to pull out of 1st and 2nd Chronicles.